Hello everyone and welcome back to Next Gen Gaming SC. Josh Snyder here, and we are set to kick off Top 8 coverage from Atlanta at the Friday 1K tournament. We have Chris on the left piloting Rey Tarkentown and Richard on the right piloting Emperor Palpatine Blue. These two players have met already in this tournament. They were paired up in the Swiss rounds, and Chris was able to take that match. We'll see if Richard can get some revenge here in the top 8 in our quarterfinal feature match. Chris is going to start with the initiative in game 1. And for the first play of the game, Chris will start with Sabine. And Richard will follow that up with Inferno 4, so ground versus space early. Now in this top 8, a very diverse breakdown of leaders. Only one repeat leader. We had 7 different leaders in the top 8. Sabine the only repeat leader. 2 Sabine ECL decks in the top 8. And then we had a Han yellow deck, Anakin blue, Jango Tarkentown, Quinlan Tarkentown. And then the 2 decks that you see here, Rey Tarkentown and Palpatine Blue. Tarkentown definitely the most represented base in the top 8, as Tarkentown has been so big in the meta for the last several weeks. So Chris is going to start with the initiative here in round 2. And Chris is going to play his own space unit, Restored Art. Now the action over to Richard. Richard is just going to trade some damage between the 2 space units. Inferno 4 attacking into Restored Art. And now Chris taking advantage of the Rey action ability, paying 1 resource, putting an experience token on Sabine. So Sabine a 3/4 in total stats, but would attack for up to 4 power, or deal up to 4 damage, I should say, with the on-attack ability. Richard puts Emperor's Royal Guard in the ground arena. Now it does not currently have Sentinel, but it is a 3/5, with Richard having Palpatine as his leader. Chris attacking into Richard's base for a total of 4 damage with Sabine. Richard claiming the initiative for the first time here in game 1. And we'll see how Richard responds to the 3/4 Sabine Wren. Richard does have the opportunity to trade with the space units. We saw him put the damage on each of those 2 space units in the last round. He could make that trade before Restored Art gets an attack in. And it looks like that is going to be the first action for Richard. Inferno 4 and Restored Art both defeated. Richard does get the when defeated ability on Inferno 4, getting to look at those top 2 cards of the deck. You can keep them on top, put them on the bottom. Looks like he is going to keep both cards on top. And now Chris taking advantage of Sabine once again. Another 4 damage to Richard's base, 8 damage on. So Sabine doing some great work early here in game 1, and Richard is going to make another similar play. This time Royal Guard attacking into Sabine. They trade 3 damage each. And Chris is going to use the epic action on Tarkentown, defeating the damaged Royal Guard, and Richard plays Rune Hako. And because one of Richard's units was defeated in this phase, Rune Hako gives Sabine -1/-1. Sabine just had 1 HP remaining, so Sabine is defeated. And now Chris is going to play another space unit, Green Squadron A-Wing. And Richard is just going to claim the initiative. Chris has another Green Squadron A-Wing. That is quite the play in round 3 for Chris, doubling up on Green Squadron A-Wing.
You really do need that money, don't you?
Showing 6 damage coming from the space arena, which could put Richard about at the halfway point in terms of HP remaining on his base. There is no doubt that Chris wants to go as wide as he can on the board, which means put as many units on the table as he can, because Richard has plenty of great one-for-one removal options. So Chris wants to have multiple threats if he can at all times. Richard starts this round with a resupply, going up to 6 total resources. And Chris gets in with 3 damage. Richard coming back across with 3 damage, and then Chris using that second Green Squadron A-Wing to get another 3 damage into Richard's base. And just like that, it's 14 damage on Richard's base to just 3 damage on Chris's base. Now the action back on Richard. He does still have 2 ready resources. Richard is just going to claim the initiative, and Chris is absolutely flooding the board here. Another turn with 2 units played. Chris plays another space unit, his second restored arc here in game 1, and also plays Yoda in the ground arena. Now Richard will be at 7 total resources here in this round. So next turn would be the first turn he could play Super Laser Blast. Richard is main decking 1 Super Laser Blast, and the way Chris has been loading up this board, and Richard already having 14 damage on his base, that may need to be a card played in the near future for Richard. Looks like Richard is holding on to Vigilance, so Vigilance could defeat one of those Green Squadron A-Wing and then heal some damage from the base. That is what Richard is going to do. So 1 Green Squadron A-Wing defeated from Vigilance, and Richard heals 5 damage from his base, bringing the total back down to 9. And Chris is going to attack and defeat Rune Hako with Yoda, restoring 2 damage from his base. Chris taking out the Rune Hako because he doesn't want Richard to be able to take advantage of Palpatine's ability, dealing a damage and also getting that extra card. So Richard has just claimed the initiative, and Chris attacking with Green Squadron A-Wing and Restored Arc, but not after the Green Squadron A-Wing got an experience token with the Rey action ability. So Richard up to 15 damage on his base. Chris plays another copy of Yoda, defeating the first Yoda. So Chris gets to draw a card from the when defeated trigger on that first Yoda. And then we see Chris deploying Rey, attacking with Rey. Rey giving herself an experience token, hitting Richard's base for another 3 damage. And Richard just has 12 HP remaining, still staring down 4 units on Chris's side of the table. He desperately needs a Super Laser Blast here, but I don't think he has it in his hand. So to start this round, Richard is going to once again have to answer one of those Green Squadron A-Wings. Both are now defeated. This time, Takedown defeats Green Squadron A-Wing. Chris is going to attack with Rey, another 3 damage to Richard's base. And Rey's on attack ability giving Yoda an experience token. So Yoda now a 3/5. And Chris still showing a possible 5 more damage between those 2 ready units. And Richard is going to deploy Palpatine. He does not get to use the when deployed ability because Chris did not have a damaged non-leader unit. but he felt like he had to get Palpatine out there. Yoda hits Richard's base for 3. Richard plays Emperor's Royal Guard in the ground arena. That is currently a Sentinel unit with Palpatine in play. And Chris gets in for another 2 damage to Richard's base with Restored Arc. So Richard with 26 damage on his base, just 4 HP remaining. Richard has 1 ready resource and Palpatine ready in the ground arena. We'll see if he decides to attack or just claim the initiative. And Palpatine is going to attack into Yoda. And Richard uses the on-attack ability, defeating the Royal Guard, dealing an extra damage to Yoda. So 5 total damage dealt to Yoda. Yoda defeated. And then Chris is going to respond with Luke Skywalker, giving Palpatine -6/-6. And Richard thought that Palp was defeated there, but he still had 1 remaining HP, so Palp will stay on the board. Richard does have the initiative, but he's going to have several threats he has to answer here in this round. 1 attack from Luke would finish this game, or an attack from Rey and Restored Arc would finish the game. This is a very tough spot for Richard. He will have to answer Luke with his first action, or if nothing else, put a Sentinel unit in the ground arena. And then he has to deal with one of the other 2 units. Richard does have the answer for Luke. Fell the Dragon will defeat Luke Skywalker. Chris attacks Richard's base for 3 with Rey, giving an experience token to Restored Arc. Richard plays Power of the Dark Side, and Chris just defeats Rey, leaving Restored Arc ready to finish the game. Chris with the early lead here in the quarterfinals at SCG CON Atlanta. We are getting set for Game 2 here in the quarterfinal feature match of the Friday 1K tournament at SCG CON Atlanta. Chris versus Richard. Rey Tarkentown versus Emperor Palpatine Blue. Make sure to check out Laser Gaming. The link to Laser Gaming's website will be down in the description below. They make some fantastic Star Wars Unlimited tokens. And you could put in code NEXTGENGAMING to get 5% off their Star Wars Unlimited products through the end of February 2025. And take your gameplay experience to the next level. Starting out in Game 2, Richard will have the initiative. He plays Inferno 4, the same turn 1 play he made in Game 1. But Chris is going to change things up here on turn 1 as he plays R2-D2 in the ground arena. Richard claims the initiative, and Rey is going to have the action ability used. 1 experience token on R2-D2. So Chris has a very formidable R2 in the ground arena, a 2/5 that could theoretically get another experience token from Rey. Rey's ability allows you to put an experience token on a unit with 2 or less power. So R2 only having 1 printed power, and the experience token bringing him up to 2. So he's got room to grow. Richard starting with the initiative in round 2. And Richard is going to play Resupply, ramping up his resources early in Game 2. Chris attacking with R2-D2. 2 damage to Richard's base. Richard attacking into Chris's base for 2 with Inferno 4. Chris playing Yoda, and then Richard claiming the initiative. So Richard holding on to the initiative early in Game 2, and Chris trying to once again build a solid board presence, put multiple threats on the table, and force Richard to have multiple answers. Now Richard will start this turn with 5 resources after playing Resupply last turn. And let's see the play that Richard makes here. Does he have some removal early in round 3? And that's what we're going to see. Takedown will be played. The question is he taking down Yoda or R2-D2? Both are valid targets. And Richard is going to defeat R2-D2. And Chris is going to go ahead and attack with Yoda. 4 damage on Richard's base, restoring 2 from his own, but then Richard taking Inferno 4, dealing that 2 damage back to Chris's base. And Chris will put another unit in the ground arena, K2SO, and Richard is going to use the Palpatine action ability pretty early here in game 2, defeating Inferno 4 to deal 1 damage to K2SO, and he gets to draw a card. And I think they are correcting it now. So with Palpatine's ability used, that action ability, you have to complete that ability. So he has to draw the card first. Then he can do the when defeated trigger from Inferno 4, which allows him to look at the top 2 cards of the deck, and then he can either keep them on top, put them on the bottom, or put 1 on bottom, leaving 1 on top. So Palpatine action ability resolves, and then the Inferno 4 when defeated ability resolves. So Chris able to claim the initiative after Richard used the action ability. Now Richard at 6 resources. Still has 2 to go before he could deploy Palpatine. But you know he would like to get there as quick as he can. Chris is starting the round with an attack from Yoda. 2 damage to Richard's base. Once again, Chris restoring the damage on his own base. And Richard is going to play Power of the Dark Side, forcing Chris to defeat one of those 2 units. He defeats Yoda. Yoda had already got in the attack in this phase, and Chris is able to draw a card off of Yoda's when defeated ability. And now Chris attacking Richard's base with K2SO, 4 damage, and Richard playing the second resupply here in game 2. That's going to bring Richard up to 7 resources. And look at this play for Chris. He knows that Richard can deploy Palpatine next round. So Chris actually uses the epic action on Tarkin Town to defeat his own damaged K2SO, having Richard discard a card off of the when defeated trigger. And then Richard only had 2 cards left in his hand. Chris plays Pillage, discarding the other 2 cards. Richard is top decking. What a couple plays for Chris. Now he does not have any units on the board, but he did just dispose of 3 of Richard's cards. And taking K2SO off the board means that Richard cannot just deploy Palpatine right away here in this round and take control of K2SO because it was damaged. So what a play for Chris. Richard starts this round out with Salacious Crumb, healing 1 damage from his base, and Chris is going to deploy Rey with his first action of the round. And now Richard is going to play Palpatine's Return, returning the Darth Vader that was discarded last turn. And Richard will get to search the top 10 cards of his deck for any number of villainy units with combined cost 3 or less, and he can play each of them for free. So Rune Hako is going to come into play for free. And Richard does choose to ambush with Darth Vader. So 5 damage to Rey. Rey still has 1 HP remaining. And Vader will take back 2 damage. But that does leave Richard with all of his resources exhausted. So Rey is going to attack and defeat Salacious Crumb. The on-attack ability giving Rey an experience token means Rey had 3 power, just enough to defeat Crumb. And with the extra HP from the experience token, Rey is still on the board. Richard just claims the initiative, not deploying Palpatine, and then Chris playing Rivals Fall, defeating Vader. So just 1 unit left on either side of the table. We have the Rey leader unit and Rune Hako. Now Richard will start with the initiative, and it would not surprise me one bit if Rune Hako is used to trade with Rey. And quickly, Richard making that his first action, both units defeated. So Chris will take the next action. He has 7 resources to work with. Richard controls 8 resources. But Richard only has 1 card in his hand. It really set Richard back just a couple rounds ago when Chris forced him to discard 3 cards in that 1 round. So Chris just passing here. And Richard, again, just 1 card in hand. It looks like Richard will claim the initiative. So we're going to move on to the next round. Only 1 action being taken in that last round. Rune Hako and Rey trading. But Chris opting to just pass, and Richard's going to open up the next round with Colonel Yularen. That allows Richard to heal 1 damage from his base. Chris now with 8 resources. Let's see what he's going to play this time around. Chris has a load of cards in his hand. Definitely has card advantage over Richard right now. And to start this round, Chris is going to play Kanan Jarrus. And now Richard is going to use the Palpatine action ability, defeating Colonel Yularen, drawing 1 card, and 1 damage is dealt to Kanan Jarrus. And Chris is going to play Concord Dawn Interceptors. And the question is, does Richard deploy Palpatine and take control of Kanan? And there it is. Palpatine is deployed. Richard takes control of Kanan Jarrus. Chris going to use the action ability on Rey to give the Concord Dawn Interceptors an experience token. Richard getting into Chris's base for a total of 4 damage with Palpatine, and now Richard playing traitorous and taking control of that buffed up Concord Dawn Interceptors. And the board control has certainly turned around here. Richard, 3 units on his side of the table. 2 of those units belong to Chris. Chris still with an empty board. Let's see what he plays at the start of this round. And there comes the big one, Crate Dragon. 9 cost 10-10, and that is going to be something that Richard needs to deal with quickly. So when an opponent plays a card, so when Richard plays a card, Chris will have the ability to deal damage equal to that the card's cost to Richard's base or one of his ground units. So Richard is going to take Kanan Jarrus, attack into Crate Dragon, 4 damage on the dragon. The Kanan on attack trigger, discarding the Jedi lightsaber from the top of Chris's deck. Richard gets to heal 2 damage from his base. So let's see now how Richard goes about dealing with Crate Dragon. Richard with 3 cards in hand, and it looks like he's going to play perilous position. The Crate Dragon already exhausted, of course, but that's going to give Crate -2/-2. And Chris is going to deal 3 damage to Palpatine off of the Crate Dragon trigger.
Yeah, you're good. This is a lot of math. I just did a lot of math. Completely messed up your math that you'd already done. So you got to redo the math.
And Richard just having to get Crate Dragon off the table. Palpatine is going to attack the dragon. Both units defeated. And Richard not defeating the Concordon Interceptors to draw an extra card. Chris claims the initiative. And Richard has tied the score. We've got 6 damage on each base as we head to the next round. So Richard was able to deal with the Crate Dragon, but it did come at a cost. Kanan Jarrus, Palpatine, and a perilous position all used up to answer Crate Dragon. And look at this play from Chris here at the start of this round, playing Confiscate, defeating an upgrade, defeating Traitorous, which allows Chris to take control of the Concordon Interceptors. And now it's back on his side of the table. And I think Richard a little bit frustrated with himself. He could have defeated the Concordon Interceptors with the on-attack ability from Palpatine last round, but he chose not to do it.
I went the wrong way. Yeah, I was like, this isn't right. I went to do it on the dice.
And now Chris able to get those Concordon Interceptors back. Richard does play a big threat of his own, Supreme Leader Snoke. And that will give all of Chris's units -2/-2. Chris is going to use the Rey action ability, giving another experience token to the Concordon Interceptors. Now with the action back over to Richard, he will just claim the initiative. And Chris is going to play Luke Skywalker. Now, unfortunately, Chris has not had one of his units defeated in this round, so Luke only gave Supreme Leader Snoke -3/-3, so not enough to defeat Snoke. And then the Concordon Interceptors, they were able to get in for 1 damage to Richard's base. The Interceptors, they do have 3 power, but again, Snoke giving those units -2/-2 over on Chris's side. And now Richard is going to start out the round with another really big threat, Devastator, dealing 10 damage to Luke Skywalker. Luke defeated. Now Richard out of resources for this turn, but my goodness, he's got quite the board right now in Devastator and Supreme Leader Snoke. But there's another good response for Chris. He's got another copy of Luke Skywalker. That gives Snoke -6/-6. Snoke taken off the board just like that. Richard has no choice but to claim the initiative. And now the action back over to Chris. Some great back and forth play here. Momentum swinging from one side of the table to the other. Now Richard does still have the Devastator in play, but as of now, Chris has a Sentinel unit standing in the way of Richard being able to deal quite a bit of damage to Chris's base with Devastator. So Chris is going to play Force Throw, forcing Richard to discard a card. Richard discards top target. And because Chris controls a Force unit, Luke Skywalker, he was able to deal 1 damage to the Devastator. That damage comes from the cost of the card that Richard discarded. Top target just cost 1. Now the Devastator does have Overwhelm and 10 power, so if it did attack and take out that Concord Dawn Interceptors, that would deal some Overwhelm damage to Chris's base and open up the Space Arena. And first action of this round, Richard going to take out the Concord Dawn Interceptors. And it looks like 4 Overwhelm damage to Chris's base. But the Devastator did take 5 damage back. The Concord Dawn Interceptors only had 3 power, but it gets +2 when defending. So just 4 HP remaining for Devastator. Chris playing R2-D2, and then Richard follows that up with Darth Vader. So it's been one big threat after the other the last few rounds for Richard. And Richard is going to get a couple units off of Darth Vader this time. Another Rune Hako and Salacious Crumb. So Richard will heal 1 damage from his base off of the wind plate ability on Salacious Crumb. And now Richard has to decide, does he want to ambush with Darth Vader? And he is going to ambush into Luke Skywalker. 5 damage on Luke, 6 back on Vader. We've certainly seen this before, and we've seen it here on this channel. Father versus son. And the action is back on Chris. Luke just 2 HP remaining. Chris plays another copy of Force Throw, and with Luke Skywalker still on the board, Chris will be able to deal some damage with this discard. And that's a pretty big discard. Richard discarding Vigilance, which costs 4, and that allows Chris to deal 4 damage to Devastator. So the Devastator is defeated. Richard follows that up with Emperor's Royal Guard, so he clearly wanted to play the Sentinel unit in the ground arena to try and protect, I'm assuming, the Darth Vader, because now Luke has to go through the Sentinel unit. But look at this, Chris plays Redemption, and he fully heals Luke Skywalker. So now the Royal Guard will not defeat Luke Skywalker. The 5 damage that was on Luke gets put on Redemption. Another momentum swinging play for Chris. Richard has the next action here. And he is going to use Palpatine's action ability to defeat Salacious Crumb. 1 damage dealt to Luke Skywalker, and he draws a card. And then Luke goes ahead and attacks into Royal Guard, defeating the Royal Guard. And Chris gets to restore 3 damage from his base. Richard did retain the initiative, but now he's staring down a big threat in the Space Arena. With Redemption in play for Chris. And to start this next round, Richard is going to take Luke Skywalker off the board. Rune Hako attacking into Luke, both units defeated. And Chris will do the same thing. He'll take R2-D2 and attack into Darth Vader, defeating both units. And look at that, great play for Richard. He follows that up with Power of the Dark Side, taking out Redemption. And just like that, you had no units on the board. Chris does immediately play another threat, though, K2SO. And Richard playing Inferno 4. What a game this has been. We're just over 20 minutes here into Game 2 after a 12-minute Game 1. And Chris is going to play Regional Governor, and he calls Super Laser Blast. So Chris has taken away the option of a board wipe for Richard while Regional Governor is in play. Richard is just going to claim the initiative. And Chris is going to continue to swarm the ground arena, smuggling tech into play. And that is going to give Chris all kinds of options here in this next round if Richard doesn't have an immediate answer. If I am counting correctly, I believe Chris has 10 resources available. He's got at least 3 or 4 cards in hand, but with Tech on the board, he's got a lot more cards in his hand with those 10 resources. Every card in Chris's resource row gains smuggle. To start this round, we see Richard using the Palpatine action ability, defeating Inferno 4. 1 damage dealt to Regional Governor. Richard will draw a card and then use the when defeated ability on Inferno 4. And it looks like Chris is going to the resource row. He is going to smuggle Redemption into play. That does use up all of his ready resources, healing the 1 damage from Regional Governor. That 1 damage goes on to Redemption. And now Richard is going to play his own big unit, Reinforcement Walker. And Richard gets to look at that top card of his deck. He chooses to draw the card. And now the action back on Chris. Does he get some damage in with the units he has in the ground arena? That is exactly what he's going to do. So he's going to attack and do a total of 7 damage to Richard's base between K2SO, Regional Governor, and Tech. Now with Richard having the Reinforcement Walker in play, he will have the ability to continue to draw some cards or even heal damage from his base to try and mitigate some of that damage coming through right now. But Richard certainly has a tough decision to make. Regional Governor is shutting down Super Laser Blast, while Tech is giving Chris all kinds of options from the resource row. So which threat does Richard feel like is more detrimental right now? Richard is going to attack and defeat Regional Governor. And now he's deciding whether or not he wants to keep the top card and draw it or discard it to heal 3 damage from his base. Richard going to draw another card. It looks like Chris taking a look again through the resource row. He's got all kinds of options, but to start things out, he's going to make sure to get in 6 damage with Redemption. 19 damage on Richard's base. Now the action back over to Richard. He still has all of his resources ready. And Richard showing us why he took out that Regional Governor with his first action. Richard playing Super Laser Blast, defeating every unit on the board. And Chris is going to deal another 3 damage to Richard's base off of K2SO's when defeated trigger. So now Richard with just 8 HP remaining. Action back on Chris. He's going to start the process over once again. He plays Green Squadron A-Wing. Richard has his own 2-cost unit, Colonel Yularen, healing 1 damage from his base. Chris plays Yoda. Richard has just claimed the initiative, and Chris is going to play the 3rd copy of Force Throw here in Game 2. Richard discarding another Colonel Yularen, so 2 damage dealt to Richard's Yularen in play because Chris controls a Force user, Yoda. And now, since Richard has claimed the initiative, Chris using the action ability on Rey to give A-Wing an experience token, and then Chris is going to smuggle another Tech into play.
It's a fun match.
So once again, Chris has built up quite the board. 21 damage on Richard's base, 7 damage on Chris's base, and at this point, Richard just desperately trying to stabilize once again. He's got an answer for Tech instantly The second time around, takedown defeats Tech.
Kill Yularen.
And now Chris is going to attack Colonel Yularen with Yoda. Yularen defeated. 2 damage back onto Yoda, and Chris restores 2 damage from his base. And now Richard is going to play Vigilance. But Vigilance will not be able to take out the A-Wing because of that experience token. So Vigilance defeats Yoda. Chris gets to draw a card. And Richard heals 5 damage from his base, bringing the total back down to 16. Chris uses the Rey action ability to give the A-Wing another experience token. Richard has claimed the initiative. And Chris attacks with A-Wing, putting that 5 damage right back on to Richard's base. And now Chris is going to play another pillage. Richard discarding 2 cards. It was Reinforcement Walker and Fell the Dragon. He discarded Fell the Dragon, and look what Chris just followed that up with. Poe Dameron. Chris absolutely went to town there that last round. And now he's got 2 big threats on the board. That A-Wing is a 3/5, but attacks for 5 because of Raid 2.
Did Frank win?
So once again, Richard is going to have to make a play early here in this round to mitigate what is about to come across. Poe Dameron could deal up to 8 damage. The A-Wing can deal 5 damage. Richard has 9 HP remaining, so it does appear that Chris will need 2 actions to deal fatal damage. Richard plays Avenger for the first time in this match. Chris is forced to defeat one of his 2 units. So the Green Squadron A-Wing gets defeated. Poe Dameron certainly the bigger threat here, as Poe can deal up to 8 damage to Richard's base in 1 action.
All right, I'm gonna attack in your base.
And here comes Poe. Poe's going to attack into Richard's base. That's at least 6 damage. Now the question is,
I'm going to discard Yoda.
is he using the on attack ability?
Damage here.
He is going to discard 1 card to deal 2 damage to the Avenger. And he's discarding another card to make Richard discard a card. So 6 damage dealt to Richard's base, 27 damage on. Richard just claims the initiative. And I smell a Luke Skywalker coming. The 2 damage to Avenger sets up a wonderful Luke Skywalker play, because Avenger just has 6 HP remaining. There it is. Luke Skywalker gives Avenger -6/-6. The Avenger is defeated. And now an attack from either one of Chris's units would finish this game. That's going to do it. There's the fist bump. Chris wins a long, grindy 30-minute game 2. Takes the match 2-0, and Chris with Rey Tarkentown is heading to the semifinals at SCG CON Atlanta. Thank you so much to everyone for tuning in. Stay tuned for the semifinal feature match from Atlanta. May the Force be with you, and until next time, take care.